slides. Can you see my screen?
No, not yet.
Not yet? Okay, so let me try again. What about now?
Yes, now it's okay.
Yeah, okay, great. So for those that has been on the previous presentations, that you've seen this, that's the third time you're going to see it. So this conference series has two main objectives. It's to create awareness and provide tools in the process of generating innovation from scientific discoveries in biotech. This is dedicated to the Argentinian ecosystem, and promote interaction among the members of this ecosystem. So that's the two main objectives of this series. The series is a structure in, like saying, a timeline kind of from the identification of new ideas until their commercialization. So previously on the last two talks, we covered the first stages. So that's academic technology transfer, in which most of these ideas are generated. Today, we start with the second step, let's say, which is already when these ideas are kind of like identified. Then it's the time to invest, find investors to make these ventures grow. So this is going to be Ernst today, and next week, Ariel Sabina from AstraZeneca. And then the third part, we are going to look a little bit, we are going to zoom in specific cases of startups from different angles. And finally, we are going to discuss how the products of these biotechs are validated preclinically, clinically, and finally, how the commercialization and market access usually can happen. So this is a little bit, a couple of words about the organizers. Myself, I'll be your host today. Again, Silvana de la Pena. So she is representing the network of Argentinian scientists in the Netherlands. She's not going to be present with us today. And finally, Sebastian, who is supporting us from the Argentinian Ministry of Science. Some housekeeping rules. So presentation and QA will be in English. This presentation is already being recorded. All participants will be muted through the presentations. Please make your questions in the chat. So with Ernst, we agreed that the presentation is going to be divided into 3 different sections. So after the end of each section, we'll leave a couple of minutes for people to make your questions. If you feel you want to make it orally, you can raise your hand. And if you don't feel like talking or you cannot show your face, let's say, you just can write it on the chat. So Ernst kindly agreed to extend this presentation for an extra 10-15 minutes if there are more questions. And at the end of the whole series, let's say, so we are going to send a questionnaire to all the participants for the different talks to have your feedback, your input, and see how we can go from there. Some words about Ernst. So Ernst, he has a PhD in cancer genetics from the NKI, the National Cancer Institute. So he works as a business developer from TNO. This is a Dutch company. Then until now today, then he joined Aglaya Oncology Fund. So it's a venture capital investing in the oncology space. So he's been there until 2014. He's still there. And then he had different roles in the board and also on the management of different biotech startups. There are like 3 there, which is Supreme, Gene Therapeutics, and Imagine. He recently created a very nice initiative, which is called the VC Life Foundation. So it's some kind of like, if I completely write complete from the website, some kind of like a forum of discussion of the different VCs in the Benelux area on the life sciences field. And finally, recently, he created his own consulting company, which is called Oncopreneur, in which he supports and advises people creating their own ventures in oncology. So that's everything from my side. So now we are going to pass the microphone to Ernst. And Ernst, we are more than eager to listen to you.
All right. Well, thanks so much, David, for the invitation. So actually, David asked me to give this presentation before the Dutch soccer team played against Argentina, because I guess if it would have happened afterwards, I'm not sure whether I would have given the presentation. But no, to be honest, I'm not really a soccer fan, but because every time my friends ask me over to watch the game, then they typically lose. So, let's talk today not about soccer, but about something else. There you go. Is that visible?
Yes.
All right. Well, David already gave away my disclosures. So I split up the presentation in 3 parts. I think first it's very important to explain how the healthcare ecosystem works, and also all the challenges that come with the drug development process, which also gives an understanding for why venture capitalists are needed in this space. And we'll be giving some more details on the whole investment process, and I try to be, giving you some very concrete tips, at least for those people that consider of starting their own biotech venture. Well, to talk about the healthcare ecosystem, well, basically, of course, that all starts with patients, right? So patients come in the hospital, and patients are sick. They can, of course, suffer from a whole variety of diseases, COVID, but people can come in with cancer or diabetes or heart disease or something else. And then basically patients are treated, or treatments are recommended by their doctors. And there's a whole range of other healthcare providers around them, surgeons, but also pharmacologists and a whole range of people. But of course, the patient ultimately decides whether he or she wants the treatment. And also the healthcare insurance company also decides more often now that whether the patient could receive a treatment, which is particularly now with the modern medicines that of course cost a lot of money, is more of an issue, right? So it's important to realize that fact that not all medicines are actually being used for reason that either the patient doesn't want them, or the doctors want to prescribe the patient something else, or the insurance company doesn't want to pay for it. So where do these medicines come from? Well, it all starts, of course, with the universities. And actually, most of the medicines that we have today consist of thousands of studies being done in academia. So it typically takes around 50 years of research in the academic labs to actually come to a novel medicine. And the fastest medicine that I know of is RNA interference, which was discovered in 2000, and it took almost less than 20 years to actually develop that scientific invention into a new product for patients. But taken to the extreme, actually, immunotherapy, for instance, there's some echo on the line.
Yeah, I think, can you mute Anabela Jimenez? Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, is that better? Yeah. So, but say just take immunotherapy as an extreme example. Immunotherapy is a revolutionary concept in oncology, where immune cells of a patient are being trained or re-educated to kill a cancer cell. And that concept was already being invented by the Egyptians, so well before Christ. But it took them, a couple of thousand years to actually figure out how to use that in cancer. So it can take quite a long time to develop academic science into products. What happens then, of course, is that companies are being formed when the time is ripe for technology to be translated into products. And that's where, of course, when governments also come in. I mean, they also, of course, also fund public research, but they sometimes also fund the early stage of a venture. And then there are investors that are willing to sometimes provide these biotech with money. Banks normally don't provide money to biotechs, just for reasons that, there's a lot of money that needs to go into a biotech, while for a very long time, they will not be able to show any profit. So it's just too risky for banks, and that's why the VCs are important there. I should also, of course, mention the regulatory authorities like the FDA and EMA. I'm sure you're quite familiar now, having experienced the whole COVID pandemic. So the healthcare drug development process is one of the most regulated industries that we have in the world. and therefore, yeah, it's very important to develop a product in a very qualitative manner. Now, what has changed in the last 2 decades or so is that the majority of new medicines is actually not coming from the pharmaceutical industry, or at least not being originated by pharma. Most of the new drugs are actually coming from biotechs. So these are startups that just can consist of just a few people, maybe 10 or 20 or a little more, that take an academic invention or something else that they started and try to translate that into a product. And the reason that biotech is now sort of in the lead there is that biotechs are just more flexible than these very big pharmas that we have out there, right? I mean, there are just 20 big pharmaceutical companies out there that have like 100,000 employees per company, and it's just very difficult for them to be innovating. I mean, because you need to be flexible. And you need to be agile in a fast-changing environment. So biotech is very good at innovation, but what pharma is good at is actually manufacturing a product at large scale, also marketing that and selling the medicine. So that's sort of the role. The big pharma is basically the party that picks up a molecule from biotech at some point in time, and then actually produces that and brings that to the patient. But even here, business models are changing. I mean, some of you might have heard from rare diseases, which are diseases that don't occur a lot. So just a couple of patients that have these diseases, and there it's actually feasible for a biotech to market and sell the product on their own, simply because there are not so many patients around there. So you don't have to build up a large production facility and a big sales group. Now, to speak a little bit about the drug development cascade, drug development is incredibly tough. Let's begin with that. Initially, once something is coming out of academia, the first thing you do is basically try to validate the disease biology, right? So, for instance, if you have discovered a novel medicinal target in oncology, you need to be certain that that drug target is actually driving the disease. Once you're convinced of that, you start to make medicines against the target. And particularly what you do is you screen hundreds of thousands of molecules against this target to actually come up with a couple of them that can inhibit, so downregulate or inactivate the target or whatever you want to do with it. Nowadays, we actually have a lot more technology available. So in the traditional way, we're using small molecules, so very small chemical molecules. But nowadays, you also have antibodies to treat patients. So that these are actually the antibodies that you also produce. But being infected with COVID, you can actually make them synthetically and also make them recognize the cancer cell. And even more so, you can actually arm these antibodies to drop off a little bomb in the tumor. So that's a lot of technology there is out there, which actually works in the patient. So that's quite nice. But it does take quite a long time to actually bring that to the patient. So once you have, developed a drug or have an idea from, well, this might be a drug that I want to test in patients, then first you need to test it in all kinds of animal models, because the regulators say, well, we first would like you to test it in dogs, in rats or monkeys before you're allowed to test it in humans. So that also takes a couple of years, and then you can finally test your drug in patients. Well, you initially just start with a very low dose, and you escalate the dose until you get to a point that you start to see a lot of toxicity, and then you try to find a dose which is giving a certain effect on the disease. So, for instance, shrinking the tumor, but at the same time, of course, the drug should also be tolerable by the patient, so it should not have that much toxicity that the patient will discontinue with the treatment. So it's a very fine balance sometimes. So once you've established a safe dose, then you do a phase 2 trial where you test the drug for so-called efficacy. So in like 100 patients or so, you test whether the drug is indeed, for instance, shrinking the tumors in a larger patient population, kind of proving that the drug is working. Once you've done that, then you need to do an even bigger study, more patients, up to 1,000 patients, where you basically take your experimental drug and have another arm, which is sort of the standard of care. So that's the drug that's being used for that disease at the time, and you kind of compare the two. So is your new experimental drug outperforming the treatment that is now being used to now being given to patients? And once you've done all of that, then you can actually finally file that whole dossier with the regulatory authorities to ask for market approval. And I should say that's not the first point that you will interact with the FDA or the EMA. All the way along this process, you interact with the regulators to ask for approval to proceed with the next step, right? So by the end of the day, it takes you around an average of 15 years from, coming from academia, having this nice drug target to actually bring something on the market. Sometimes it goes faster, of course. We all know, of course, the success of the COVID vaccines. But I think it's fair to say that with COVID vaccines, for instance, the RNA vaccines that Pfizer is using, actually a lot of the technologies that's being used there was already in use for more than a decade in cancer vaccines. So that technology is not new. And that is actually a nice example of what happens if you spend all your money and take all the risk to develop something with a lot of people around the clock, right? So then you can actually develop a drug pretty quickly. But for more complex diseases like cancer, it typically takes you around 10 to 15 years to bring something to the market. So why are people doing that? Because it sounds like a very risky business. It is super risky. And I think the reason that people do it is that it's a high risk, high reward game. Of course, we know the success of Pfizer and BioNTech with their COVID vaccines. So Comirnaty, that brought in 37 billion in 2021. So quite a bit of money. And BioNTech was actually a fairly small biotech that was not doing very well, and all of a sudden now they have billions on the bank. So that's also sometimes how things can go in biotech. But even further down the line, you can see plenty of other drugs out there that generate billions of revenue per year. But it's just it's a minority drugs, right? So most of the drugs that you develop actually don't make it. Of course, because these drug products can be very lucrative, it also means that biotechs that develop these drugs, they can be acquired at pretty high prices. So there are a couple of examples here. Acquisition of Grail by Illumina, or the acquisition of Trillium by Pfizer, which were like billion-dollar deals. Now, another thing which is interesting to note is that if you look at the stock market performance of biotech stocks, so healthcare stocks, there's something interesting going on, which is that they are pretty resilient to crisis. Whether it's a COVID pandemic or an economic crisis or war or something else, whenever that happens, of course, the initial reaction is there will be a dip, just like the Dow Jones would have, but it's not as deep as the conventional indexes. And I guess the reason for that is that, by the end of the day, healthcare stocks are a relatively safe investment, right? Because every year we spend more money on healthcare simply because, we as people don't take care of our bodies that well and of the planet, right? So people are getting more and more sick, unfortunately, because of poor lifestyle habits, poor nutrition, obesitas, but also smoking, or also the connection between air pollution and certain diseases are becoming stronger. So there will be an increase in healthcare spending, and therefore we need new medicines, and therefore new biotechs will be created. So from that perspective, you could say that healthcare stocks are pretty good long-term investments. I should say, though, of course, that those biotechs that are on the stock market, which are relatively young, so don't have products on the market yet, they of course can be volatile, right? Because I showed you how long this drug development process is, but you can imagine if a biotech gets back with a certain amount of data which is not looking good, so the drug is not doing its job, well, that has a big impact on the stock performance. So this graph basically gives you an idea of what the risks are involved in, bringing a biotech venture to or an oncology product or a disease product, a medicinal product to the finish line, so to market. So basically, when you have an idea which is coming from academia, your chances are almost 0% that you will be successful. That doesn't mean that you should not try it, because if you really believe that if you game-changing idea, I think you should always try it. But you need like 15 more years and a lot of capital investments to get to the market. So that doesn't mean that you need to go all the way to the market. So biotechs typically, or at least in the old days, biotechs were kind of acquired when they were in phase 2. So remember that's the stage that you start to test your drug product in around 100 patients for efficacy. So to see whether your drug product indeed has an impact on a certain disease. That was sort of a point that biotechs got acquired. So, that meant that after 8 or 9 years of starting your biotech venture, you would be acquired, of course, permitted that you would indeed have some good data to show, because it's all about the data. But nowadays, I think what's good to see is that there's so much interest in the pharmaceutical industry and a lot of competition between these big pharmas in acquiring these biotechs, that at least in the oncology space, there's a lot of interest already at the early stage of big pharma to actually acquire a biotech, simply because there's so much competition between big pharma that they think, well, why don't we just buy something very early, and we can buy a lot of them. We know that many of them will fail, but if if you buy 6 different biotechs and one of them will succeed, then it will still be a good investment for us, or a good deal for us. So I think that opens up some opportunities for entrepreneurs that they can, sell their company at a more early stage. IPO, so going to the public stock markets like the NASDAQ or different stock exchanges, that's also becoming increasingly more realistic for even early stage companies. Back in the old days, the phase 2 stage was a bit the stage that biotech companies could become public. But nowadays, if you are still preclinical, so you're not in the patients yet, then you can already consider to go public. So that again also opens up some possibilities to get capital from public markets. So I'll just stop there for now and take any questions on this part before I move on to describe the role of the venture capitalist in this whole process.
Yeah, so anybody has questions? You can raise your hand or you can write it on the chat. Okay, I will start with one. So you mentioned that, one of the reasons why a big pharma, it's interested on the developments of academia, of the startups, is that they are not flexible enough just to be like this fast-paced environment. But so big pharma, they can, let's say, because there are so many different things going on now in biotech. Mm-hmm. To which extent pharma can cover internally all the bases, let's say?
All the bases?
All the different possibilities, all the different technologies, all the different potential routes, let's say.
Well, they basically they can't. So they of course have their own internal drug development programs that they work on, but for the really innovative science, they would always look to either partner with a biotech company or license with another biotech company or acquire another biotech company. So they basically have a whole shopping list of what they're looking for online almost,
Yeah.
But also one of the reasons that big pharma is not as good as developing new programs is because it's a big organization. So there are many management layers, and typically a CEO, he stays with the pharma company for 3 or 4 years. That person has a sort of a strategy, and he says, well, we're going into oncology. And then there's the next CEO who says, well, I don't like oncology, we're going somewhere else. So that kind of means that all the oncology programs are being stopped. And that doesn't mean that these programs were bad, but simply because there's a different strategy. So there are a lot of changes in strategy. And actually, there are quite a lot of examples also in the Netherlands that pharma terminated the program or sold the program, which in the end actually became a blockbuster drug because a biotech picked it up and decided to develop it. Yeah.
So I have a question. We have a question from Alejandro Ledesma. So he says that the health ecosystem is growing steadily, and the new non-drug development companies are slowly starting to emerge and taking strong steps, as Illumina, for instance. So they are into DNA sequencing. So how's the European health venture capital sector is reacting to this?
To these mergers of these big companies?
No, so to the appearance of these new ventures, which are not focused on drug development, but rather on other technologies other than drug development. If I understood correctly the question.
Yeah. No, Grill is indeed, of course, a very interesting company, because what they do is basically they develop technology to detect cancer cells in the blood, right? And the promise there is that they would like to do that when patients don't have visible lesions on a scan, right? So you have simply a more sensitive method. And definitely in the United States, you can see more investments coming from US investors in those type of ventures. I think it's fair to say in Europe that originally there was quite a bit of excitement about diagnostics, but that has indeed become a little bit lukewarm, I would say. I think that the reason for that is that let's say the market uptake of diagnostics is not guaranteed, right? So that there's a whole complexity that comes with that. So I showed you the healthcare ecosystem. When it comes to diagnostics, there's another group of individuals that is very important, which are pathologists, right? So these are people in the hospital that, for instance, look at tumor biopsies and say, well, this one has a certain biomarker, so that tumor should be treated with this treatment. And you're kind of competing with them as well in a way, which makes it complicated. But also, such a test needs to be reimbursed by, again, the healthcare reimbursement organization instance. And it doesn't always happen. I mean, it has been pretty difficult for biotech companies to kind of negotiate that with healthcare reimbursement organizations. Because basically what you do, you kind of prevent disease from happening, right? So for some reason, the whole healthcare system is kind of focused on treating patients that are very sick, but it's not very much organized of trying to prevent disease, which is a pity, I think, because of course I do think that prevention is the best medicine, right? But yeah.
Yeah, so I have another question. So you mentioned that when it comes to the preclinical validation, you mentioned animal models, but then now it's quite a strong trend to move beyond animal models. And if the FDA is working on new guidelines and similar things are happening in Europe to, let's say, introduce or accept into drug development proof of concepts, preclinical proof of concepts, non-animal models. I mean, how is the sentiment when it comes to venture capitals to take this as a proof of concept?
Well, I think the venture capitalists basically they will be fine with that as long as the regulatory authorities will be fine with that too. Okay. So as long as the regulatory authorities still demand us to do animal toxicology studies, then I think it will be the usage of such models will be more like a nice to have than a need to have. But if we can indeed sort of prove that such in vitro models or can sort of replace animal models or kind of result in using less animals, I think that will be advantageous, right? I mean, actually, Aglaya, so that's the VC firm that I work for. They're also an investor in a company called Mimetas, which is an organ-on-a-chip company. And indeed, one of the things that Mimetas is trying to do is to use their 3D models, which are sort of like tissue models, so there are more cells in there, as a means to get to better qualified hits in drug discovery campaigns. And by doing that, you sort of reduce attrition, and you can take less molecules forward in animal models. That's the idea. Yeah.
Okay. That's okay. So I think we can move to the second stage.
Okay. In terms of the startup cycle of a biotech venture, this is sort of what it looks like for a normal startup, right? So you start off with your venture, you need some money to get things going, and at some point you start to make revenue. And that, this is something which is typical for an IT company. But for biotech, it looks completely different. So the red line again is revenue, and basically biotech companies are loss making until you basically either have a product on the market, and then even then you need to sell it, or the company gets acquired. So it's still loss making in that point, but you do actually get money back. And actually, Mimetis is a nice example of that, because that was a company in our portfolio that was actually selling services and products. So we were always joking that it was the first company in our portfolio that was actually making money, because that was true, and we were only spending money on biotech companies. So how it basically looks like is that initially you start with your venture, you get non-dilutive money, so subsidies, grants from local authorities or regional authorities, EU, things to kind of work on your proof of concept data. And at some point you get seed investments from an angel. So that can be like a high net worth individual, a very rich individual that is willing to give you some money to do some more work. And then you need to be ready to actually get your money for venture capitalists. And in biotech, most of these venture capitalists, they deploy quite a bit of capital in a biotech firm, simply because it's very expensive to develop medicine all the way to the market or to phase 2. I mean, even if we were to, for instance, develop a drug and everything would go well, so no major hiccups and things like that, then still you need around 3 to 4 million to develop a new medicine. So that's quite a bit of money. You don't raise that all in one financing round. So you do multiple financing rounds called a Series A, a Series B, a Series C, and you typically raise money from multiple investors, because there are very few investors out there that can chip in all that money by their own, and most investors will not do that simply because of risk spreading, right? They want to spread the risk of their investments. So VCs will work together, so-called syndicates, basically pooling the money and investing that in a biotech firm. And basically, of course, if you go public, that's of course also a point that you can get money into the company. So how does a venture capital firm work? So basically, it's a legal structure where on one hand you have members called limited partners, which are investors. So that could be a high net worth individual, that could be a pension fund, that could be a large bank. Any kind of vehicle that is willing to invest money in a fund, which can then be deployed in several different biotechs. Now, the venture capitalists, like myself, are also called general partners, GPs, and they kind of are in charge of actually deploying that capital, right? So they make the picks of in which companies that money is being invested. And the way that works is that for instance, you have 100 million, and you basically decide to invest that in, I don't know, 10 companies. But you could also use a strategy that you say, well, I only want to invest in 5 companies, or maybe in 20. But Most VCs will actually focus their investment in a limited number of companies for reasons that it's quite a bit of work to manage those investments, right? You need to be on the board. There are lots of things going on during that rocky journey for biotech. So there's always something going on. And you are essentially with a small team. So most VC firms are, just 5 to 20 people working there. The big ones maybe more, but it's not a lot of people. Of course, there's a whole network of advisors around them. Oncologists we have, for instance, or people from working in pharma that are advising us as well. But it's a fairly small team. And what we then do with this money, we of course make our picks of the companies that we want to invest in. So we find those companies ourselves because we stumble upon some great technology that we see in university, and then we make contact with the professor and say, well, we would like to build a company around your technology. That can happen. But of course, we also get approached by many people that are looking for money, right? So to give you an idea, we sort of get like 200 deals per year or something like that. Just sit down a little bit and standing all day. But so what we then do is that we basically invest in a company, and in return we get shares in the company, and the management team also gets a certain amount of shares. So of course, when you start a venture as a founder, you have shares, but that typically gets diluted a lot because there's so much money going on to a biotech venture that will get diluted. So how investors would like to keep management happy and also make sure that they profit in an exit. So when a company is getting acquired, is by offering them special shares called ESOP. So which is around 10 to 20% of the total pool of shares, and that's on being divided when the company is being sold. I think what's important to note also for venture capital funds is that if a company gets acquired, then money flows back to the venture capital fund. But then first the LPs are getting paid along with the interest that they have paid. And then the VC starts to profit from anything that's left. So, if you have a 100 million fund and you sell a company for 100 million, that only returns the money to the LPs. But if you start to, if you sell a company for 150 million, of course, then you have 50 million left, and then you start to kind of profit in that as well. But typically, you need a couple of those exits to be able to actually return a fund to the investors, right? So the VC only starts to profit in most cases when multiple companies are being sold. So what is an exit? An exit is basically a process whereby the investor disposes his stake in the company for hopefully need a good return on investment. But more often than not, the investor doesn't get back anything. An IPO, so going to public markets, is not an exit technically because you still have shares, albeit public shares, but of course you can dispose of them more easily by releasing them in the public markets. And as you can see from this graph, M&A is actually less common than IPOs in biotech. I think this is an interesting piece of data, which is some data from the European Investment Fund showing the performance. So the European Investment Fund is an LP in more than 100 life science investment funds. And basically what they did is they presented some data of nearly 2,000 investments done by VCs that they backed, right? And what you can see is that roughly 75% of the investments the VCs do, they don't bring back any money or little money. And 25% of that does. And actually the 4% that gives more than 5 times back the invested capital, those are typically the exits that return most of the funds, right? So the VC funds are basically driven by a few outlier investments that provide superlative returns. So how does this whole journey look like? Well, I told you, basically start off with raising a seed round, or if first getting some grant money. Then you would actually raise a Series A, which can be around 20 to 30 million. At that time, you can already start to speak to pharma to see whether they might be interested in partnering or licensing with your company. If not, you can raise more equity financing from investors. Raise a Series B, which should be around 40 to 60 million, because then you start to develop something into the clinic. Which is another point that you can look. Maybe you can go to public market if the public markets are good. Nowadays they aren't, but who knows? That can change in a year or so. Or you need to raise again Series C to actually develop that drug even further. So it's very important to think about that. When you start, to kind of map out where you want to, interact with pharma investors, and when you want to plan your IPO, of course. And you also need to be looking for options, because market conditions can change quite rapidly. I think what's also very important is to note that there are certain innovation hype cycles. You can see them in every type of industry, but also in healthcare. So immuno-oncology, for instance, was super hypey in 2015. A lot of investments, a lot of biotech deals, and now there's a little bit of disillusionment because many clinical trials have failed. But now, in the last year, we did see a new immunotherapy being improved. So there's some hope is now there. So what that means for an entrepreneur is that you need to be knowing where you are on this innovation hype cycle, right? Are you at the beginning of the peak, or are you already on the way down? And that's very important, because VCs are unfortunately very sensitive to trends, because they also know that pharma is also very sensitive to trends. So they speak to pharma a lot. And if they are not interested in their products, then, well, why would they invest in a biotech company? Of course, you can still be bold as an investor, and if you really believe in something, invest in something. But you need to be mindful then that it can take you quite a few years to sell that company. Though this is what I mean, what things can change quite rapidly. So back just a couple of years ago, the right time to go public was around phase 1 and 2. But nowadays, in 2021, it kind of has changed. So it's more like preclinical, late preclinical phase 1 that you can already start to become public. So these are things to be looking for. Also, it's interesting to see how certain things can affect public perception. So the green line here. So this is looking at the performance of a stock when a company went public for the first time. So the green line here is actually anti-infective companies. So companies developing, vaccines or antiviral products, and not a lot of people were interested in that, or they were kind of underperforming in comparison with the rest. But because of the whole COVID pandemic, that has changed quite a bit. So that's something that you can profit from, of course. So that brings me to this part. So if there are any questions on that.
Yeah. So I have a first question, and so you mentioned that at the very beginning, let's say, before these new ventures can have a good shot at having money from investment from VCs, they have this like a maturation investment or money from governments and things like that. So from your point of view or your experience in the Netherlands or maybe somewhere else, what it's like a right strategy for, or the good involvement of governments and financing and supporting this kind of new ventures?
Yeah, I mean, indeed, you also have to be creative, I think. I think it's important when you look for grants that you need to be sure that there are no strings attached. So, some of these grants, they basically mean that you still have to negotiate for IP, or some of the IP will become owned by the state. That can create some difficulty to receive an investment. But yeah, I mean, for instance, in the European Union, of course, there are a couple of European grants that you can try to get, or some of the local ones. And also there, of course, it helps to team up with the leading advisors in your field, so they can kind of help you out with that as well, or point you to the right direction of the right grants.
Okay, so we have another question from Alejandro Ledesma, asking if a really early stage startup is looking for initial funding, what's the usual percentage of dilution it might have to expect? 10 or 20%, for instance?
I think, so most venture capitalists, they will seek a majority share in the company. And the reason for that is that they would like to have control on the company. So basically that means more than 50% of the company. That's what they're looking for. So they can sort of control the travel direction of the company. That doesn't mean that the management team doesn't have anything to say. By the contrary, management team, of course, is very important, because the VCs know that both team and the science are equally important. So therefore, management team need to incentivize, and that's how they do. That's why the ESOP is important, right? So that's the pool of options I talked about. So the VCs keep that intact. So whenever a company raises more rounds, the shares would normally be diluted, but the investors keep on adding more shares to that pool. So the management team gets their share.
Okay, so if there are no other questions, so I think we can move to the last part then.
Yeah. Okay. So how does the investment process look like? Well, basically, like I mentioned before, we can either source around deals ourselves by so we have we've good networks with the leading innovators in the field, but we also get a lot of deals sent to us. So at Aglaia, I think we got like 200, 300 deals per year that we looked at. But the bigger life science funds, the ones that operate more broadly, the ones that also look at infectious diseases, cardiovascular, diabetes, immunology, things like that, they easily get 1,000 deals per year. So that's quite a bit to look at. And these deals are screened by the team, so the investment team, typically by persons called associate or analysts. So they kind of screen the deals. Well, as you can imagine, there's not a whole lot of time that people can use to actually screen the deals, right? So I think initially people just spend at max maybe 30 minutes to look at the proposal, and they're kind of looking for sort of red flags. So if there's something, we'll get to that in a minute. If there's something going on, then they kind of put that deal on the side, right? So that's what happens. So basically, I think 80% of deals already gets rejected at that stage. And then at least with Aglaia, what we typically do is invite companies for a presentation. And then we, of course, that is important so we can see how the team performs and how they handle our questions. And if that goes well, then we start to do more diligence. So we look in the literature, we start to speak to our advisors, we reach out to other specialist advisors in that area. And we start to ask questions to the biotech teams. And if that's still positive, then we involve our advisory board. We present them the deal, and they advise us of whether or not to proceed with the deal. Maybe we can follow that, or we can say, well, we still want to do the deal. But some VC firms are pretty strict in that. So if the advisory investment committee says, well, we don't want to do it, then basically that's a no. Then typically, that means we want to, if it's all green lights, then we'll make a term sheet. So that's sort of a heads of terms of the conditions under which we would like to invest. So of course we invest money, and how many shares do we get? How do we interact with each other? Basically, in such a contract, you kind of have agreements for the sort of marriage, but you also plan for the divorce, right? So that's how a legal contract looks like. But you of course also, for instance, speak about how to what happens when companies get offers from pharma. When can you liquidate the companies, stuff like that, all kinds of things. But once the term sheet is signed, it's not done yet. So then we will do actually a full due diligence, which means we go in depth, looking at all the documents that the company has. So legal documents, financial documents, all the signs, all the data, everything. And then it's of course it can still happen that we actually don't do a deal, right? But in most cases, I would say we do continue with doing the deal, but in that process we also identify shortcomings, which we can then give back to the company. Say, well, these are the things that we identified. Let's fix those with the first investment tranche. And then it's part of closing the deal. So you make all the legal documents, and then you wire the first investment tranche. You form the board, which meets every 4 to 6 times a year. Yeah, you're off with the company. So this is kind of the process I talked about, a bit more detail. So what are the things that we look at? Well, like I mentioned before, the data, the technology is super important. Team is also very important. I mean, I always compare biotech development as Formula 1. So you need a good car, you also need a good driver, and you really need both, because if you don't have both, then you can't win. And it doesn't mean that the team needs to be complete, right? Once when you first look at the venture, it can still mean that other team members need to be recruited, and that's fine. I think it's the most important thing about the team is that the people are knowledgeable, they know how to develop a drug, they know the risks, and they know how to mitigate the risks, and they're honest and transparent about the pitfalls. I think that's the most important thing. And of course, being have the perseverance, right, to carry on, because it will be rocky. The business plan. So really, of course, you have the technology, but how do you want to bring that to the patient? So that involves many things, right? IP strategy, the whole clinical development strategy, business development strategy, all kinds of things. Ultimately, it all depends on the unmet need of a certain indication. So how big is the unmet need? So what is the need of a specific patient suffering from a particular cancer, and how will you actually improve that? And what's the data to support that? Intellectual property, of course. Also, the advisors are important. So, have you been able to assemble a group of the best innovators around you, or the top oncologists, or other people? That also gives kind of a stamp of that things are going well. But there are easily around 100 objectives and subjective criteria used to make an investment decision. So I wanted to give you some concrete recommendations when you consider to start your own venture and consider to reach out to VCs. I think there it's very important. Just take your time to develop a very solid business plan, development plan, which means study your competitors. If they sold their company, look when that occurred, which development stage, what was the data that they presented that drove that acquisition or the partnering deal. Are you actually better than your competitors? So if you could benchmark your molecule, or molecule is probably difficult for an early stage company, but a genetic model with their compound, that will be very useful. Determine, of course, when you have to plan what's the money that you need, when do you want to exit, or when do you want to first try to exit? So when do you want to talk to pharma? What is the type of data that you need to present to such a discussion with pharma? What scientists do you want to attract? Advisors, very important. Pick your advisors well, and also make sure that they are actually contributing, because some of these big names, of course, good to bring them on board, but if they can't really contribute, so why would you have them then, right? Get feedback from entrepreneurs, but also pharma. So like I mentioned, pharma, they have their own shopping list online that you can look into, so you can kind of get an idea what they're looking for and whether your proposition is in line with that. But sometimes they also organize partnering days that you can visit, or you might even be able to talk to them to get a sense of what they are looking for. Of course, there are many other entrepreneurs out there that you can talk to, which can help you out. All the grants we talked about. I think what's also important is to what are the key translational models. So again, it would be useful to look at competitors, what they publish at conferences, for instance. You can kind of identify what the workhorses are for a certain indication, or maybe you're developing something for glioblastoma or something. Well, then there are particular models that industry likes to use. So these are the models to then also use, because people will compare your drug with their drug, right? So benchmarking is important there. You're benchmarking with the standard of care treatments. So the treatment that is being given for a specific indication, or competing treatments. Of course, patenting your invention is important. I think also invest a bit of money in a professional look and feel. So a website nowadays is pretty easy to make yourself if you are short on cash. It can easily look pretty attractive, and that helps, because like I said, the VCs they get sometimes 1,000 deals per year, and if something looks attractive, then they are more inclined to spend more time on it. So also make an attractive slide deck there, right? And if you can actually hire designers for that if you are not good at that. There are many VCs out there, hundreds of them, yeah, just study which ones will make most sense. So most of them, they have their investment strategies on their website. Some of them invest early, some of them late. So if you're started from academia, probably doesn't make a lot of sense to reach out to investors that that you already know that they become interested in a later stage. And use your network there. So if you've been talking to advisors, oncologists, for example, that can be good inroads to VCs. I mean, for instance, in one of our biotech firms, we have a number of advisors that said, I recently talked to an investment firm. Can I make an introduction for you? So that's kind of how it works, right? And that always works better than simply sending something to their info address, right? So try to get an intro. So other things, well, that's more of when you get invited for a pitch. So it's important to realize that just like a job application procedure, people judge you from the first second. That's just how it is. So I think it's like I mentioned, it's very important to be honest and transparent. And I mean, in biotech, you always have data which is not looking super good, and it's fine to show that. I mean, investors know that not everything looks good, and it's more important there to say, well, this is how we look at it right now. This is what we want to do to kind of improve that or show that it works like that. So that's kind of also the risk mitigation I talked about. VCs would like to see people have sort of a strategic thinking, right? So what are the things that could go wrong, and how will they approach it? It is indeed a sort of important to have a sort of a social connection with an investor. That's also kind of how it works, right? So do some research on your investor. Maybe there's something non-work related to talk about, or maybe that VC fund just to raise a new fund. So it is those things are kind of important as well. Data is very important. I mean, there's a sort of a saying in biotech that in God we trust, all others must bring data, and that's kind of how it is. So data is very important. So show that, and also put the rest in sort of a backup slides, because you will get questions. Of course, being eager and motivated is of course important. VCs try to make an impression of whether you are a person that can cope with the stress of a biotech journey, right? Make due diligence easy. So sometimes, as an investor, I talked to a company and they said, I asked them questions and they sent me like 10 papers and said, well, it's somewhere in there, And then of course you don't make it my life easier. So just make a master deck, of all kinds of slides, and when investors ask for something, you can just pull up the slides. it does. Of course, it's quite a bit of work initially, but you will benefit it later on, because you will have to answer these questions anyway later on. Well, don't talk down on the competition. So there are always competitors, but just be kind to them, and yeah, just bring data to show that you stand out. There's also a fine line of asking for money, not being desperate for it, but the other way around. You should also not come in like, you kind of sit back and say that you don't really need the money. So there's a really fine line there. I think there are more things to that, but I think this is sort of what we have. And I think actually with that, I think that's it.
Okay, great.
We got past time quite a bit, so
yeah, no, but it was really interesting presentation. I think, what is really, really unique, and what we are really profiting from having you here is like this, your last slides, and we just like gave all this advice on how to approach, what to do, what not to do. I think that's really, really precious, I would say, information. I mean, people pay for this kind of information many times. So yeah, I have a one question. So this is like, this whole conference series is meant for people in Argentina that are trying to become entrepreneurs. So they are entrepreneurs and things like that. So Argentina, has like, being from Argentina has advantages and disadvantages. One of the advantages, for instance, would be like they have some structure and people will form, and it could be like, from a cost perspective, especially in the preclinical space, that could be like potentially advantageous, cheaper than developing things in Europe or the US. So, and also one thing that we were discussing with you is like, clinical trials, especially in oncology, are getting, from a regulatory perspective, are getting more and more complicated. So how a place like Argentina, for instance, could showcase itself vis-a-vis the investors or people willing to invest in early stage ventures?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's quite like that. I mean, I do realize, of course, that the life science ecosystem in Argentina is relatively underdeveloped. But I guess there's also an advantage to that, right? Because in the bigger life science ecosystems like Boston, or in the San Francisco area, or in Europe, for example, in the Denmark area, or maybe even the Netherlands, there are quite a few biotechs, and they're competing for the same brands and the same venture capitalists. So I guess if there are not that many biotechs out there in Argentina, that might also be an advantage, right? Because it's more easy to stand out. Let's put it that way. But I think it is important, but for the governments, of course, to provide some kind of startup money, and that should be doable, right? Because there should not be that many biotech companies out there that ask for money, and with relatively little money, as you say, David, probably you can get pretty far, because R&D is not as expensive as in Europe, United States, I would say. But I think in terms of researching VCs, if you go that route, then some of these VC firms, particularly the bigger ones, they can also invest internationally. Whether they would actually invest in an Argentinian company alone, I would have some doubts. So probably that would mean that you would need to set up a subsidiary in the United States or in Europe. Not a bad thing to have a subsidiary in the United States, because it also gives you a starting point to meet other investors there, but also it makes it easier to go public when things go well. I mean, you can't go really public when you don't have a presence in the United States, at least not on the NASDAQ.
Okay. Any other questions from the audience? Okay. Yeah, I have another question. So it's related to, so you mentioned the different important topics that you evaluate from an application, let's say, or someone asking for money. So what about what is the criteria with respect to the IP? So what are the things what is like a good scenario for you in terms of IP?
Yeah, well, I have to say that we have also invested in companies that don't have any IP, but then of course there should be sufficient argumentation that we will be able to file IP, right? So in those cases, we actually have a patent firm do a so-called freedom to operate search or landscaping to kind of identify patents that could interfere with our patent application or be prior art. So we kind of, the question there is whether the claims in the patent that we want to write up are sufficiently novel and inventive, of course. That's the main thing. Those are also the same questions that we ask when we do invest in a company that has IP. So we typically ask IP firms to look at that. And I think IP generally is something that, you know, is sort of fixable because one patent is nothing. So you always need more to kind of create a shield of protection. So whenever you have a patent which is doesn't give you a lot of protection, it's kind of solvable by filing another patent. Because if you sort of progress into the drug development journey, you start to make better compounds, and at some point you have the molecule that you want to test in humans, you can file that specific compound, right? That's a composition of matter patent, it's called, which gives you unique protection on your specific molecule.
But for instance, when it comes also to, even if it's patented or not, when it comes to ownership, like for instance, I mean, in many cases, startups are result as just the maturation of academic collaborations and things like that. So what is the information, I mean, you require just to understand what belongs to who?
Yeah, now, I mean, I think in terms of the license agreement, of course, I mean, that's something, it's a little bit different organized per university, right, or institute. Yeah. So, I mean, for instance, in Germany, then the inventors was always economically incentivized as an inventor, but in the Dutch situation, it can be different from institute to from hospital, from university. But by the end of the day, we're not dealing with the inventors themselves, but almost always with the institutes, right? So that's where we have the agreement with. And the institutes, in turn, they have to have an agreement with the inventors. Yeah.
And this is my last question. So usually, I mean, when it comes to startups or the key role, it's like, yeah, oftentimes the CSO. So sometimes, I mean, oftentimes it's the entrepreneur itself. So what are from a personal traits, what do you look at an entrepreneurial people that will just take or claims that will take care of moving this venture down the road? So what are the things, I mean, you expect from that person?
Yeah, I think the most important thing, I mean, what I've kind of concluded in dealing with a number of these biotechs and their management teams is simply that people like to learn. It sounds a bit stupid, but people need to be sort of coachable, right? So sometimes people can be pretty stubborn in what they do, so they kind of ignore signals or feedback from people, and that can be difficult individuals to work with. But if you are an individual which is very receptive to feedback, I mean, you can still, of course, disagree for good reasons, but it doesn't mean that you receive feedback that you have to agree with them. But I think those individuals that can work well with feedback and actually do something with that, that's very important. And because building, a good relationship with the board, the investors, but also with your partners, right? I mean, if you partner with pharma, there's also a collaboration going on, and if you do whatever you want to do, that doesn't go well for your partner, right?
So, no, absolutely.
But these are the things we look for, and of course you need to be knowledgeable, but that speaks for itself, I would say. And I think transparency is very important. So I think people are sometimes really very much inclined that whenever they have some like bad data or something bad happened, that they don't want to tell it because they're afraid that the investors will react very negative to it, right? That they will, I don't know, quit with the company. But most investors, if they invest in a company, they're willing to try to solve it because they invested a lot of money. So they're not gonna shut down a company just by that, So at least that's not what we do.
Okay. So yeah, I think if there are not any other questions, so I have one before saying goodbye to everybody. I just want to make an announcement for next presentation. So I will share my screen again. So it's about the presentation next week. So next week we will have Ariel Sabina. So he's a head of global scientific partnerships in oncology for AstraZeneca. So the next presentation is going to be a special one because it's going to be a round table. It's going to be slides. So it's going to be Ariel. Ariel, he's Argentinian, so it's going to be the first one in Spanish. So, and the idea is that Sebastian is going to send you an email with explanation of what the presentation is going to be about and what we really want from you. The people that are going to be there is just to send us questions. So with Ariel, he will prepare his presentation and then we will have a discussion. So just to explain briefly what Ariel does. So Ariel, what he does is to look around the world, developments in academia that could be interesting for the objectives of AstraZeneca and set up collaboration partnerships. So that's very interesting for people working in academia and working from clinical aspects and also from preclinically. So Ariel, he's going to explain us how AstraZeneca does it. And for him, the idea is just to have like a discussion, let's say. So that's why we are going to get an email and we expect the feedback from you. Okay, and having said this, Ernst, thanks a lot for your time. I think it was a great presentation. I myself too learned a lot, again, how venture capitals work. And yeah, I hope everybody is having some inspiration as I did back home.
Thanks a lot. You're welcome, David. Glad to hear that was useful. So
yeah.
And I of course hope that some of these individuals that are listening in that at some point or maybe already now are considering to start the venture, because I think it's really worth it. Do it, at least. I can tell that also from.
Yeah. So then the next we are going to have two presentations about entrepreneurship. So about entrepreneurs, people that created their own companies from two different perspectives. One like guy who just after her PhD did a company, and then someone that's spin off from being a PI. So we are going to focus on that too, because I think that's the start from the whole story here, the entrepreneur, I would say. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Thanks, Ernst. And